Civil War. Let's talk about a little bit about the causes and effects of the Civil War. The Civil War stemmed from the South's resistance to the Northern abolitionist movement. And as the abolitionist movement grew in power in the North, the South feared that they were going to attempt to abolish slavery in the South. This was accelerated by lots of different things. One was California being admitted to the Union as a free state, and so that shifted a lot of power in Congress towards the abolitionist movement. Also, the election of President Abraham Lincoln was viewed as an abolitionist president, sort of made the South go further towards wanting to secede. So when it became clear to the South, or in the mind of the South, became clear that slavery was going to be abolished, the Southerners decided that they were going to secede from the Union. So the people who called for a new nation for the South were called secessionists. And they called the new nation the Confederate States of America. So you had the Confederates fighting the Union being the Northerners, the South being the Confederacy. They established their own government. They had a capital in Richmond, Virginia. They later moved that capital, but initially it's in Richmond. They had their own president, Jefferson Davis. So they were establishing their own country, basically. On the exam, they'll sometimes ask about important battles of the Civil War, and they'll also ask about sort of strategic aspects of the Civil War and strengths and weaknesses of the North and South. The North had almost all the advantages, had a much larger population than the South. It had a more developed manufacturing base. So they were able to produce weapons and goods like that more effectively. It had a more developed transportation network. So at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, the North had 3 times the amount of railroad track, for example, than the South. So they had a much more developed transportation network. So they had almost all the major advantages going for them. The only thing that the South had that was a real major advantage was military leadership. They had much more experienced, more tactical military leaders, notably Robert E. Lee and people like Stonewall Jackson. So those were Southern generals that just were more experienced, and because of that experience, the Civil War lasted 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. It should have lasted maybe 2 years based on all the advantages the North had, but the South made so many strong tactical maneuvers, and the North made some blunders, and it sort of protracted the war much longer than it probably should have gone based on the advantages and disadvantages that they had otherwise. So let's talk about some of the major strategies, and then let's talk about some of the battles and watch how these strategies are played out. So the strategies of the North, one was to try to isolate the South, close off their access to shipping along the eastern seaboard so they couldn't get new supplies. Another one was to try to capture the southern capital. So they would send invasions in to try to capture the military leadership in the capital, and that's why they moved it. It was at one point in Richmond, Virginia, but they moved it to other places to avoid capture. Another one was to split them and make them fight a 2-front war. So they tried to split the South and make them fight on two different fronts, and to basically isolate them and sort of starve them out. Remember, the South had a lot of cash crops, but not as much food crops, so they were trying to sort of starve them out. They were trying to basically isolate them, and that's why the Civil War is sometimes referred to as a war of attrition. Who's going to outlast whom? The Southern strategy was really to surge into the North and try to take control of some of those important supply lines and trade routes, to try to take control of some of the manufacturing base that the North had, that kind of thing. So the North also had a key strategy of trying to prevent the South from being able to invade and surge into the North effectively. So let's look at how the Civil War plays out. There are over 1,000 battles in the Civil War, but for the purposes of the exam, we're going to talk about 5 of them that are very, very critical and important ones. The first one is the Battle of Fort Sumter. Not a huge battle, but important because it's the first battle of the Civil War. Southern General Beauregard fired on the federal fort in Charleston Harbor, and that started basically the Civil War. The Northerners were so confident that victory was assured and that this was kind of a joke, the people actually came out and sat on the hillside with picnics to watch the battle. But the South overran a lot of this region, and Northerners ended up having to scramble for their lives as the Southern troops came through. So this was the first battle of the Civil War. There were several battles that happened, and then we had the Battle of Antietam. It's the single bloodiest day of the war in terms of loss of life and injuries, casualties. This was the first major attempt by the South to surge into the North. And under Robert E. Lee, they attempted this surge, but Northern General McClellan defeated the Southern Army and stopped this first major surge. Then we have Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville was a major win for the South. The Southern forces defeated General Hooker's Army of the Potomac, which was one of the major Northern armies. So that Northern Army was defeated by Robert E. Lee's forces. But it was sort of a bittersweet thing because in this battle, Southern General Stonewall Jackson was killed. He was a rallying point for the troops, and he was a very sort of charismatic and somewhat crazy guy. He would ride out into the battlefield holding his finger up because he felt that was lucky. And he really liked to ride around out into the battlefield, and he was riding back, and his own troops thought he was an enemy soldier attacking and shot him. So he died in Chancellorsville, so that was sort of an emotional loss for the South, even though they won a big victory in this battle. Then comes Gettysburg, probably one of the most famous, or the most famous battle of the Civil War, and for good reason. There were many other battles in between Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, but Gettysburg was the second major surge of the South into the North. They were trying again to surge in and take control of some of the Northern territory, and again that attempt was thwarted. There's a major charge called Pickett's Charge, and that failed, and sort of that turned the tide at Gettysburg, and basically Lee's forces lose to the Northern forces commanded by General Meade. At this point, the South is very depleted, and this was their last real chance to surge into the North, really. So with this was kind of the beginning of the end. And the last one is Appomattox. At Appomattox Courthouse, Robert E. Lee's forces get surrounded by the Northern forces, and Robert E. Lee surrenders. So there were a few small skirmishes that continued to go on after this, but really with Lee's surrender, that was the end of the Civil War for all intents and purposes. And this photograph you see here is an actual photograph of the Appomattox Courthouse on the day of Lee's surrender. It's kind of interesting that photography was invented just shortly before the Civil War. So the Civil War is one of the first wars in history that is very well chronicled in photography.